some of the aspects of the different spheros, in addition to the one of Chesed which we're in, because in understanding the idea of spiritual elevation through connecting to the spheros and going through the different of the spheros one by one, Keser, and then Chochma, Bina, Chesed, Gvura, Tiferes, Netzach, Hod, Yesod. The author here, in the chapter of Chesed, is giving different examples of practical acts of Chesed, as we're commanded to do in the Torah, and some of the deeper ideas in Kabbalistic thinking that a person should have when he's fulfilling these actual mitzvos, and the effect that these intentions have when he's performing them in the physical realm, the effects that they have in the spiritual realm. And in exploring the effect that these acts have in the spiritual realm, we've been going into some detail about some of the spheros, in addition to that of Chesed, which basically develop the idea that he's saying in terms of the general context of how acts of Chesed affect this realm. So remember, some of the major spheros that we've been discussing are Chochma and Bina, male and female, husband and wife, giver, recipient, where there's an interaction between the male and the female aspect, giving birth to an influence below, and that's brings into being the sphere of Tiferes, which is like the spiritual birth or offspring of the mother and the father, the Chochma and the Bina. But there's also the surrogate parents on the way, which is Chesed to the right and Devorah to the left, which also have an effect on the way in which the child that's produced from the union between Chochma and Bina, male and female, right and left, is brought down in the form of Tiferes, either to the right towards Chesed or to the left towards Gvura. And therefore, the way this child, as it were, of Tiferes is born, either leaning towards the right or the left, towards Chesed or Gevurah, is going to have a big impact on what happens to the spheros below Tiferes, in the direction of the flow of divine energy down through the spheros into the final sphere of Malchus and creation. So that a lot has to do with Tiferes, and Tiferes therefore becomes like a receptacle on the one hand for receiving the influence of Chochma, Bina, and also of Chesed and Gevurah, but Tiferes is really like a giver, down to Yesod and Malchus. In any case, the result therefore then of Tiferes, which is like the child, the offspring that's birthed from Chochma and Bina or Chesed and Gevurah, is that this child has to be circumcised. And that brought us to the discussion of, number one, the chesed that a person does in ensuring a healthy birth, in the symbolic sense of bringing down divine energy through the spheros down into Tiferes, but also that the child that's born in Tiferes has its productive energies expressed in an unoccluded, productive way into the world. And that was expressed through the sphere of Yesod and then Malchus, where Yesod corresponds to the sexual organ, and the Malchus corresponds to the crown of that organ, which can become occluded by negative spiritual forces, which have to be cut away in order for the flow to come down into the world properly. And these are some of the general ideas that we were discussing regarding the mitzvah of Chesed involved in giving birth. And we spoke there about intentions for the intimacy and the idea of being fruitful, multiply, and then also the idea of bris milah and the doing away of the different klipos, and we spoke about 3. But that brought us into a pretty deep explanation about what Yesod is and what Malchus is and what the klipos are, these occluding spiritual forces that have to be cut away. And that brings us to this next third section or expression of Chesed, which is about Bikur Cholim, visiting the sick. And the idea here is as follows. Remember that if the spheros represent a hierarchy in the spiritual realm, and these spheros are like divine filters through which divine light is projected down from the highest level in God of Ein Sof down into the world of Asiya, that's the world of creation, then that light as projected through the spheros is actually translated onto the realm of physical creation. And that's true, therefore, everywhere through creation you're going to see the pattern of the spheros. And that's certainly true regarding the human being, which is at the pinnacle of creation. And therefore, we discussed how the human physiology actually has within it the pattern of the spheros, which is part of the human soul. And the human soul has within it the pattern of the spheros, which is presented in the hierarchy of the higher realms as well, as a reference to what we call the supernal man. So that Keser, the all-inclusive, and Chokhmah, Bina, and Das are the mental faculties in the hierarchy of the spiritual realm, compared to like a man's head. Hesed and Gvura, right and left arm. Tiferes, central torso. Netzach and Hod, right and left leg. Yesod, that central conduit or channel through which all of that energy is kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? Funneled, regathered, recollected, and then kind of spent down or what's the word I'm looking for? Emitted downward through the lower sphere of Malchus. And that pattern of the spheros is present in the human soul. And since the body is a physical manifestation of the soul, those spheros are manifested in the physical human body as well. So that the physical acts we do are connecting to the spheros in our souls, and those spheros in our souls are connecting to the spheros in the hierarchy of the spiritual realm, which we call the supernal man. And as we go through the motions, therefore, down with our bodies, connecting to our souls with the right intention, we're actually affecting those spheros in the supernal realm as well. And that's why he's been speaking about the chesed involving birth or of circumcision having an effect on that realm. And now we're going to see a third example of chesed, the act of taking care of the sick or visiting the sick, which is going to express a similar idea as well. You were going to say something, I think?
Yeah, so with this whole diagram, all the spheres together, would that be considered like a male kind of thing? Or I know there are some that are male and female, but it kind of ends with like a male spheros.
Yes, Malchus in that respect is masculine, but it's also feminine vis-a Tiferes.
Okay.
So all the spheros are...
It starts with it, but then...
What's that?
Like through Tiferes, like...
Tiferes is masculine vis-a-vis Malchus, so Malchus is the recipient of Tiferes.
Okay.
But then Malchus becomes masculine vis-a-vis the next sphere down, which is going to be the Keser of the realm below it. So that all the spheros really have a duality of male and female. So in order to understand this properly, it would be appropriate, particularly since considering a little private discussion I had with Shimon, to go into some of the details of the soul. And the basic idea is as follows, is that if we're talking about the mitzvah of chesed as far as visiting the sick is concerned, it's worth speaking a little bit about what their notion of sickness in Judaism is. And the basic idea, this is certainly true with Eastern medicine, and it's even recognized by modern medicine in the Western world today as well, that by and large, most physical ailments are really a manifestation of some inner imbalance, some inner discord. And it could be an emotional discord, it could be a mental discord, but many, many types of ailments come about because people's emotional and mental states are not at ease, they're not at rest. And therefore, much of the physical expression of sickness is really connected to the root of that sickness, which is a spiritual rot or a spiritual decay. And therefore, the physical sickness is viewed as being connected to the spiritual efforts of a person, corresponding to his different levels of soul, nefesh, ruach, neshama. And above those, you have also two other levels of soul, which are chaya and yechidah. Nefesh is generally understood by certainly the Kabbalistic view of the nature of the soul as being the lowest form of the spiritual component of a person that is responsible for imparting life and energy to his physiology. So that if the soul in general is what animates a person's spirit, it animates a person's body, that soul itself has different facets. And the Midrash Rabbah, for example, says that the soul has 5 names: Nefesh, Ruach, Neshama, Chaya, and Yechidah. The implication from the Midrash would seem to be that there's one spiritual essence, which we call soul, but that one essence of soul has 5 different names. It's referred to through 5 different names. And each of these names describes a certain aspect of the soul, a certain relationship that the soul maintains with the body. The Kabbalists understand it slightly differently. Not that the 5 terms that are mentioned there are 5 names of the same thing, but rather the 5 terms are 5 parts, 5 interconnected parts with a hierarchy going from Yechidah on the highest realm to below that Chaya, below that Neshama, below that Ruach, and below that Nefesh. Okay? So that the energy that flows from the spiritual realm into the physical realm, much like the divine energy that flows through the spheros into the world of creation, is really a flow of energy that's initiated by God, and it's described in the Torah in the analogy of a breath, that God imparts life into the physical body through directing divine energy into that physical piece of existence. That's the human physiology. It's not necessarily, of course, a breath as much as it's an analogy of the imparting of life. And since life is imparted through breath, we speak about God's breathing life into us as a way of expressing God's initiating a flow of energy from within itself, meaning within God, to ourselves. So that the Zohar says, for example, that someone who breathes from within himself. And therefore, when we talk about the analogy of God's breathing the breath of life into man, we're talking about God's translating something from within its inner essence. And I say it because it's non-gender at that level. It's not him or her. It's it, beyond our comprehension and inability to qualify in any way. But the divine is imparting something within itself, a part of that self, transmitting it down into, through the realm of the different worlds, the final physical act of creation, the pinnacle creation being mankind, and parting. Therefore, there is this interconnectedness between the human being and the divine. And we were created in the image of God, because our essence is really derived from within the essence of God itself. And therefore, these this system of translating from within the essence of God to our essence is something which we spoke about in the past as requiring a type of tzimtzum. Right? You remember that term? The tzimtzum? And just like we spoke about tzimtzum, which is the act or the process whereby the intensity of God's presence is made manifest into the world as it comes into being, so too, the relationship of God's breath, as it were, to human beings has to be undergoing a process of tzimtzum, of contraction, restriction, reduction. Okay? And that's what's happening in these levels of soul. If we've spoken about there being 5 worlds in the process of God's breathing life into creation, we spoke about there being Ein Sof, or then Atzilus, Bria, Yetzira, and Asiya, right? 5 worlds of creation, which translate the divine creative energy into existence. You find the same thing regarding the soul, right? You have, like I said, Yechidah, Chaya, Neshama, right? Ruach, and Nefesh. 5. Corresponding to these 5 olamos. So as you have tzimtzum through the olamos, you also have tzimtzum of the human soul down through those olamos. Going from more expansive, right, to more constricted. That's the nature of tzimtzum. So that if you start, for example, and by the way, these 5 worlds that I've mentioned in the 5 levels of soul also correspond to the divine name of creation, which is Yud, He, Vav, and He, where the letter Yud has 2 points. Ein Sof going upward and Atzilus going downward. So that the Yud, which has within it really 2 worlds which are one, because you're talking about a very high plane, which is translating the Ein Sof down into the Atzilus, and it's something which is very, very far beyond our comprehension and very hard to distinguish. It's nevertheless unified within this letter of Yud, the letter Yud being transcendental and floating above the ground, high up, pointing upward and downward simultaneously. There's a spectrum there, which corresponds to the upward apex. Yeah, that's Ein Sof. That's Yechidah. Yeah, but the lower apex corresponds to the downward movement of that energy, which is going to be corresponding to the world of Atzilus, or the level of soul called Chaya, and then directing that energy down through Hey, Vav, and then Hey, where the letter Hey corresponds to Bria, and then Yetzirah, and then Asiya. I don't know if we spoke in detail about the connection between the letters of Hashem's name and those worlds, but yeah, the Atzilus, Bria, Yetzirah, and Asiya, the Yud, Hey, the Vav, and the Hey, and the Chaya Yechidah, and Shama, and the Ruach and the Nefesh. In any case, as this spiritual essence is tzimtzumed and brought down, it finally comes to rest in the physical aspect of the human being, and that's the Nefesh. And Nefesh really means that. Nefesh means to come to rest. Like it says in the Torah, Shovas ve'inafash. Shabbos comes in and we rest. So Nefesh is describing that level of soul which comes to rest in the physical body. And since it's that level of soul which on that level animates all the physiological functions, the Nefesh is sometimes referred to as the animal soul. Why? Because that part of the soul which is most intimately linked with our physical, biological, as it were, animalistic functions. And the Nefesh is described as being that spark of life which is transmitted through the DNA at the time of conception, which gives force to the formulating of the embryo and then the fetus and then the developing organism for the rest of his life. Right? That's Nefesh. Beyond the Nefesh, you have Ruach. Ruach is considered to be by the Kabbalists, that is, a non-physical aspect of soul. Of course, Nefesh is also not physical. I'm only saying it's physical insofar as connected to. It's at the interface between the spiritual and the physical. And therefore it's intertwined with the physical, and it's called the physical of the animal soul. Of course, it's not physical. It's something which is ethereal, spiritual. But above that, you have Ruach. And Ruach is associated with, Ruach animates Nefesh. Ruach gives energy, imparts energy to the Nefesh, which comes to rest in the body. But itself is separate from the body. And this level of soul, Ruach, is usually associated with things having to do with emotion, or our ability to speak, which are things that distinguish human beings from animals. And therefore the Nefesh is usually described as being a non-animalist soul. Some sources do discuss the Nefesh as being animalistic, or there being an animal Nefesh, as opposed to human Nefesh. But the Kabbalists speak more of it in terms of the Nefesh being in the animal soul, and the Ruach being a spiritual, ethereal soul above the Nefesh, which is something that is shared only by human beings, not by animals. So this then would be Ruach. Now, of course, Ruach is translated as a spirit, and that's really what the emotive force of a person is. It's the spirit behind a person, or his ability to speak. His ability to speak involves this ruach, this movement of air. It's just like a person's moved by his emotions, or his ability to speak is generated through breathing. So ruach corresponds with this ability to either have emotion or speech. Above ruach, you have the level of neshama, and neshama is usually associated with the intellect, which is uniquely human. The ability to think. Animals instinct, but humans think, work out, and reason. And this, therefore, would be the next highest level in the hierarchy of the soul, where the intellect really imparts energy to the ruach, which then transmits it down to nefesh, which energizes the physical aspect of the human body. And neshama would be a very an even higher level in the spiritual component of the soul, nefesh, ruach, neshama. Above neshama, you have the two highest levels of soul, which are chaya and yechidah. Chaya and yechidah are generally viewed as being levels of soul which are very far dislocated from us, so that if there's some connection between a human being and his nefesh through the body, his ruach through his emotions and his speech, even though that's outside of him, or between himself and his ability to think, neshama, which is even higher above him, it's still nevertheless located in some way, connected and accessible to him. The proof is that we're tangibly aware of our thoughts and our emotions, and certainly through nefesh, the things that we do. But chaya and yechidah are viewed as being way outside, way above that. Like I said, corresponding to the letter Yud, which is transcendental and removed above the physical world, and something which is much closer to the unity of Hashem, up in Atzilus and Ein Sof. But in any case, they're an integral part of the way in which the soul comes down and is integrated into our beings. So given that kind of background about what the Jewish teachings, some of the Jewish teachings of the soul are, we have a basis for understanding what sickness is. What sickness is. Sickness is going to be an interference in any one of those levels, which is therefore manifested in some imbalance in the physiology of a person. If his nefesh is out of whack, if his nefesh is unhealthy, if his nefesh is impure, if his nefesh is rotten, so that's going to be manifested in ways of sickness in his body. And the same thing with a person's emotional state or his mental state corresponding to ruach and neshama. And clearly, right, it's clearly we can relate to the idea that if a person's perturbed in his thoughts, he can literally make himself sick. He can think himself sick, or he can feel himself. What's that?
Would that be in like ruach and neshama?
Exactly.
And the physical would be in nefesh.
Yes, exactly.
So both sickness and physical, and not like mental and physical.
Yes. So that mental and physical sickness are really translated ultimately down through the nefesh into physical sickness, and a physical ailment very often is connected and points to some spiritual malady in either the realm of ruach, emotion, or neshama, of thought. And you can have, for example, a perfectly healthy person. Let's say a perfectly healthy person, but he's perturbed with let's say disturbing thoughts. Those thoughts can create a paralysis in such a healthy, strong person that you can't even get him out of bed, let alone outside and do anything. Why?
Like paranoia.
Yeah, he might be paranoid. But he just whatever the case may be, or it just might be he's very upset about having broken up with his girlfriend. But the point is, a strong, healthy person is reduced to paralysis. He can't do anything, even though his body is perfectly healthy, because there's an inner sickness which is feeding on this person. On the other hand, you can take another person who isn't particularly physically healthy and not particularly strong, but his neshama is brilliant, his ruach is on fire, and the person can be stirred through this passion, right, despite the fact that he's either physically weak or disabled, and do many things with great alacrity and speed, right? All because he's being energized by the force within. So that sickness, or visiting the sick, is connected with trying to reestablish a person's spiritual balance in order to alleviate the physical, what's the word I'm looking for? The physical, what's that? No, I meant to say the symptoms. The physical symptoms of the spiritual sickness. So that our sources say when a person goes and he fulfills the mitzvah of chesed, of visiting the sick, what he's really doing is, it's described in two major levels. One level is going to visit the person and say, hey, you mean something to me. You're important to me. I miss you. Right? Society misses you. We're thinking about you. Right? And all of these kind of expressions and more that go into visiting the sick person actually help bring this person to some state of joy and happiness. And the idea is that when you visit the sick, you're actually almost externally introducing into this person some inner degree of simcha, of joy, which he's lacking because of his sickness. And that joy which you impart in the person jumpstarts him towards the road of getting better. Why? Because when you change the person's inner state, you're actually going to affect his outer state as well. And that's the one level. The other level is that when you go visit the sick person and you give the person a blessing, you pray to Hashem for this person's cure and so forth and so on. What you're doing here is you're actually appealing to the higher levels of soul, neshama, and even chai and yechidah, in order to reestablish their equilibrium or recalibrate those levels of soul. So again, in the source, through your prayer, you're introducing a flow of energy down through chaya, yechidah, neshama, ruach, and nefesh in order to, again, catalyze this person's coming to being, coming to health. And we find that we find in the Gemara examples of this. For example, there was a Rabbi Yochanan, who went to visit one of his colleagues who was very sick, and he found this colleague in a dark room, and the person was alone and lonely there. And Rabbi Yochanan said, "Are you here?" And he groaned, and he says, "I'm here," but he couldn't see, it was light. So Rabbi Yochanan, what he did was he revealed his forearm, the Gemara says, and like a light stick, light or energy glowed from his arm into the room, and he could see the sick person there. And he said, "Right, are you happy with your state? Are you content with your situation?" And the rabbi said, "You're content with your suffering?" And the rabbi responded to him, "Lo hem v'lo scharam." I don't want the suffering, and I don't want the reward from the suffering. Meaning, I've had enough. Rabbi Yochanan apparently wanted to make sure he wasn't interfering in an obtrusive way. Maybe the rabbi was accepting upon himself lovingly this suffering that was brought upon him by God in order to atone for some transgression that he did, or for some other reason. So he asked him first, right, are you content? Meaning, are you making the best of this situation of suffering, or would you like to get out of it? So the rabbi said to him, I don't want the suffering, and I don't want the reward for accepting me any further. So the Gemara says, Yohiv Yodeh, Rabbi Yochanan gave him his hand, he took his hand, and he revived him, and he actually cured him. And he did this with several people. And the idea is, if we're speaking here about the spheros corresponding to the human physiology and the divine energy going through the spheros as light, so what was happening here is that Rabbi Yochanan was calling upon the energy, the creative energy of the spheros within him. He revealed his arm, the instrument of action, that corresponds to nefesh, that corresponds to the world of asiya, the physical action, the hand's introduction and interaction with the physical world. He gave him his hand, yes, and he directed within him this energy, this creative energy flowing from the spiritual realm, through himself, through the Esser Spheros, into his hand, into the realm of nefesh and asiya, and he brought this person back into a state of equilibrium, and he was cured. It's interesting, the same Gemara says at some point later, Rabbi Yochanan was also sick. The same rabbi himself also became sick, and he was visited by one of his colleagues who did the same thing for Rabbi Yochanan that Rabbi Yochanan would do for others. So apparently there were very unique sages then who were tapping into this type of spiritual energy and healing. The Gemara asks, if Rabbi Yochanan was able to do it for others, why didn't he just do it for himself? The Gemara answers that that while a person can help others escape from prison, when he himself is imprisoned, he can't get himself out. So that sometimes, right, even though a person might be in a spiritual high where he can impart positive spiritual energy to others, sometimes his energy ebbs, and he needs the jumpstart, from others. And therefore, that shows the interconnectedness that we all have. We complement each other. Sometimes one is up, and we have to help the other one who's down, and vice versa. The one who helped the other one who was down might be down, and he needs to be helped by the one who, in the meantime, has gotten up. But in any case, what I'm trying to explore here is how visiting the sick is part of our intention, not just to make the person feel better, but actually to catalyze his being better. And that's done on two planes. Number one, by giving the person some joy, or some simcha, as a result of being cared about and spoken to nicely, and so forth, and showing compassion and empathy and so forth and so on. And also to pray on the person's behalf, in order to introduce some type of a spiritual influence on a higher plane, which is going to hopefully set things into motion within and help this person become cured. I heard even recently that a study was made here in Israel among patients in a hospital in Haifa. They took a random set of patients, I think there were 100, and these people were not in any way observant. They more or less represented, your average kind of cross-section of Israeli society. And 50 were told that while they were being treated, they were also being prayed for. And another 50 were just told that they were being treated like everybody else, but not that they were not being prayed for. And the 50 who were being not only treated but also prayed for showed a greater degree of recovery than the ones who were just being treated without the prayer, which either shows that the power of hope that they were being prayed for, well, let me put it the other way around, which shows either the prayer itself has a power to cure, to supplement the actual medical treatment was taking place, or even if you don't believe in that, it at least shows that the hope that was stirred within the hearts of those who felt they were being prayed for initiated a mentality which created a type of self-help and improved them as well.
They should
But
have had a third group that was being prayed for, but they weren't told that they were being prayed for.
yeah, that's it. Maybe that, yeah, that would be interesting. Yeah, that would be interesting. I don't know whether they did that or not. But in any case, it would certainly indicate that there is some power to prayer, either real or imagined, but still, nevertheless, some power to the prayer, and that's what we're talking about here. So, with that background, now we should be able to understand more clearly what the author is going to say here. Shlishis, the third expression of chesed, through which we actually do chesed with Hashem, is in the realm of levaker cholim v'lerofoisam, to visit the sick and to cure them. This actually implies that the visiting of the sick himself is what contributes to the cure. Not two separate things, to visit the sick or to make the sick healthy, but rather to visit the sick, and that itself being part of the remedy towards their well-being. Kach yadua, it is well known, she'ashchina hi choilas ahava mihayichud. It's well known that the Shekhinah is lovesick because of its desire to be united with God. So that if we're speaking about the divine influence through the world of the Spheros and the expression of that divineliness into the world, let's say Tiferes on the one hand and Malchus on the other, where Tiferes is the Mashpia, the masculine, which is directing divine energy into the world, and the expression of that divine energy, which is Malchus, we spoke about being two different segments, right? Masculine, female. The letter Yud and the letter Hey. The sixth Spheros and the seventh. What are the sixth? Meaning Chesed, Gvura, Tiferes, Netzach, Hod, Yesod. That's the sixth. And what? What's the seventh? Malchus. Okay? The masculine and the feminine aspect. Hashem and the Shekhinah. So that just as a human being is in a state of sickness because of spiritual imbalance, the supernal man, meaning the spiritual realm, the realm of the Spheros, which takes its form of a man, also can become sick as a result of spiritual imbalance. And the Shekhinah, the expression of Malchus, of the divine presence in the world, is sick, is kind of lovesick, out of a desire, out of anguish from being separated from its source, and out of a desire to be reunited with that source, like two lovers who can become literally lovesick, because their object of their love they've been separated from their object of their love. Where do we see this idea that the Shekhinah can be lovesick? K'dechsiv, as is written in Shir HaShirim, ki choilas ahava oni. Yeah, the verse says there, cure me with ashishos and envelop me with apples. Why? Ki choilas ahava ani. I am lovesick. And it's going to be this verse that the author here is going to develop the idea of how tending to the physical sick actually corresponds to tending to the spiritual remedy, the spiritual malady that exists between Malchus and Tiferes. Ki cholas avani, I'm lovesick. The Shekhinah, as if it's saying to God, right? Help me, cure me, because I'm lovesick as a result of my separation from you. And this is certainly true in the period of the exile, in Golus. And basically the idea is as follows, is that when Klal Yisrael, when the Jewish people are spiritually in tune, they believe in God, they learn the Torah, they fulfill the mitzvos, then they are in line, they are in tune, they are in balance, they're in harmony. And therefore, it's very natural that they will be placed in the land and they will have a very close relationship with God. But when the Jewish people become weak in their belief and they slacken in their learning of Torah, and they become negligent in their observance, what they're doing is they're severing themselves from the unique connection with God, and therefore severing themselves with the connection to the land. And they go into exile. When the Jewish people are in the land of Israel and everything in a state of equilibrium, all of divine energy that comes down to the world, whose main purpose is to express the kingship of God, where? In the land of his kingdom, where? In the city which is the capital of his kingship, which is Jerusalem, inhabited by who? The princely members of his kingdom, which is the Jewish people. All of that divine energy is directed down into Israel, into Jerusalem, into the Jewish people. But when, as a result of, like we said, neglecting that relationship, the Jewish people are exiled, all of that energy that should go into Israel goes into the nations of the world. So that all of that shefa is dispersed from the Jewish people, from the land of Israel, to the nations, so that they prosper, and the blessing that was given to them by God through Esav and through Ishmael is revealed, and they have great material bounty, tremendous power, and the Jews become interspersed among them with no longer any direct contact with that shefa, that influence that's coming down from God. Where do they get it from? The morsels that are fed to them through the non-Jews. So in their location of dispersal, whether it be France or whether it be wherever it is, Iran or America or England or anywhere else, the Jews are actually getting their special unique energy only indirectly through the way in which it's channeled to the non-Jews. And that represents a form of spiritual sickness for the Jewish people, because their energy it's coming to them in a tainted indirect source, in a tainted indirect way. And they become sick through exile, sick through having their spiritual sustenance take place through indirect means. And therefore the pasuk here is talking about God, the Jewish people, the representative of the Shekhinah, is saying, cure me of this sickness, take me out of exile, recalibrate me, bring me back to the land of Israel in order to reestablish my productive energies. However, the ability to cure the Shekhinah, the divine presence, which is dislocated and sent out into exile, biad odam, it's in the hands of human beings, lahavila samanim yafim, to bring good medicines, good remedies. K'dichsiv, as it says, samchuni ba'ashishois, strengthen me, support me with ashishois. What are ashishois? The literal meaning of ashishos would seem to be like potions in a vial, where an ashishos is like a glass vial.
Tincture.
What's that?
Like a tincture.
A tincture, yeah. Maybe it says there in English.
Potion?
Yeah. Here is referring to the vial in which you would put potions. So, samchuni ba'ashishos, strengthen me and support me with the tinctures, the remedies that can be found in these glass vessels. But the terminology of vessel should be reminiscent to you, at this point, to spheros. We'll elaborate on the metaphor shortly. The verse continues and says, Rahbeduni b'tapuchim, envelop me, cushion me with apples. And apples are also a metaphor for spheros. And
Creation.
what?
For creation.
Why creation?
For Adam and Eve.
Why so?
When, the apple of knowledge.
Yeah.
Truth.
Okay, that fruit was really not an apple.
Oh.
So that's a kind of a
Then what is it?
yeah. The Gemara discuss.
I remember there was a rabbi that once carried around like a bag of apples. I don't know. About
If it was something physical at all, then it's not clear that it was. But if it's physical at all, the sources speak about it in different terms. It was either an esrog, or it was a fig, or it was a grape, or it was a
wheat tree. The punishment was now wheat comes out of the ground instead of being on the tree.
Yeah, a kernel of wheat, which is a whole discussion on its own.
Mm-hmm.
But generally speaking, tapuchim are described in the Zohar as a metaphor for spheros. And we'll see more about it as we go along. But the simple meaning seems to be, right, it's like a sick person who's saying, support me through remedies in a vial, or bring for me healthy food like apples. Here, the Shekhinah is saying, God, support me and cure me through ashishos. And we'll see what these ashishos mean in a more metaphysical way. And the same thing with Rabpuni b'tapuchim, strengthen me with these apples. Upirshu b'tikunim, it was explained in the Tikunei Zohar, shesod ashishos, the mystery of ashishos, meaning the metaphysical meaning of this reference to, in the verse to the term ashishos, hainu kol hadvarim hakoishrim hamalchus. It's referring to everything which is tied to the malchus, or has to do with the positioning or the equilibrium of the malchus. And he elaborates here a bit by saying, be'esh yud, which is chesed, ube'esh hey, which is gvura. Ashishos, therefore, he says, according to the Zohar, is referring to two eshes. What's an esh?
Fire.
A fire. So ashishos are two fires. What are these two fires? The ashishos are the esh of yud and the esh of hey. The esh of the masculine and the esh of the feminine. Where esh yud is chesed and esh hey is gvura. What is the esh hey and what is the esh yud, or what is esh yud in the esh hey? The Gemara says that if a man and a woman, we spoke about this I think last week for anybody who was at Rabbi Lubo's son's Sheva Brachos, that the Gemara in Sota says that if a man and woman merit it, so meaning a husband and wife, then the Shekhinah will dwell among them. But if they don't merit it, they'll be consumed by a devouring fire. And the commentaries explain, based on the Gemara there as well, that it's referring to the following idea, that the Hebrew word for man is ish, and the Hebrew word for woman is isha. Both ish and isha have the letters aleph and shin. But the ish, in addition to having the aleph and shin, has a yud. Whereas isha, in addition to having the aleph and the shin, has a hey. Meaning ish, man, is aleph, yud, shin. Isha is aleph, shin, hey. So a man and a woman who have within their relationship the components of yud from the masculine aspect and hey from the feminine aspect, where yud and hey is the divine presence, they will merit having the Shekhinah among them. That's the yud and the hey. But if they don't, if the man and the female take out the divine aspect to their relationship, they remove the yud and the hey, the result is going to be fire on both sides, so that they consume one another. And therefore, ish and isha, a man and a woman's only guarantee to having a peaceful, harmonious relationship is if they have within their relationship the component of yud and hey, where his is specifically the yud and hers is the hey. If they remove that divine aspect, then it's all about egotistical self-fulfillment. And since the man and the woman are naturally polar opposites, they're going to extinguish each other, burn each other out. What he's saying here, therefore, is samchuni ba'ashishos, which means strengthen me through human beings' ability to introduce a fire, two fires, a fire of yud and a fire of hey. What is this fire of yud and this fire of hey? The fire of yud is described as being an energy which flows from a high place to a low place. It goes from high to low. The fire of hay corresponds to a lower fire that goes from a lower place to a higher place. The male-female relationship, interaction, and intimacy should be fueled by this fire of yud and hay in order to ensure that there's going to be a proper union between the two. And when there's a proper union between the two, the energy that flows between them will be expressed in a very productive and spiritually positive way. This ties back to what we were talking about in Chokhmah and Bina, in Tiferes, right? So that if the Shekhinah is dislocated because human beings have separated themselves from God, and the result is that divine energy is sent out into exile, and divine presence in the world is birthed in an unnatural way, that inequilibrium can be restored through people's returning and reinitiating that relationship with God that's associated with the letters of Yud and Hey, where in this respect the Yud is coming from God and the Hey is coming from mankind. Therefore the Shekhinah is saying, right, cure me through Ashishos. Cure me through the reestablishment of the relationship between God and the Jewish people, which starts where? In the feminine. The Hey. The Hey has to stir the interest of the Yud. The female adorns herself in order to gain the attention of the male. We spoke about how in the general world it's the opposite. It's usually the man who's pursuing the woman. And more often than not, the woman will become coy because the man's over-interest in his self-indulgence. Whereas in the Jewish way of looking at it, it's the exact opposite. The male, through his self-control, actually attracts feminine energy and interest to himself. So that in the Jewish sense, through a man's self-control, he actually causes the female to adorn herself in order to gain his interest. And when, through his act of self-control, he garners and garnishes her interest in him, causing her to attract himself towards him, he's actually preparing her to become the proper recipient for what he has to give. So in order for him to properly express his ability to give, there has to be prepared a proper recipient. And that's the Hey. And that's what we're talking about here. Through God's retracting himself, as it were, playing hard to get because of the Jewish people's infidelity, it actually results in the Jewish people's wanting to adorn itself in order to attract God's attention back to herself. And once the Jewish people, being palpably aware of the withdrawal of God, initiate a way of adorning themselves in order to re-attract God, the result is going to be that God will then direct that masculine energy towards the Jewish people in order to impregnate the Jewish people with that divine energy and reestablish the relationship of God to the Jewish people, the masculine aspect of God and the feminine aspect of the Shekhinah, which is going to initiate the reunion of that couple, bringing back everything to the focal point, which is the land of Israel, Jerusalem, and the Jewish people being the chosen people, so that special, unique relationship between God and them, like husband to wife, is renewed. And then everything will be set back into order, into harmonious balance. That's what he's saying here. So that when you go into the sick person and you initiate an interest in this person, you spark his kind of placid inner energy, you spark it to some movement, you ignite some interest. What you're doing is you're actually initiating some form of cure, some form of rebalance within this person, and that's akin to setting or kindling the interest of the masculine aspect in the spiritual realm to the feminine, which is going to initiate. It's going to have to do with initiating, catalyzing redemption. It's a very deep thing. All right, for lack of time, we're going to have to end here, and hopefully we'll develop the idea a little bit further tomorrow and then carry it to the next stage, which is where the tapuchim, the spheros, fit into this as well.